What's up, everybody? Happy Tuesday, and thank you so much for joining us today. We have a first-time guest presenter, Jeff Lesher, here with us today, and I am super excited. It's really interesting. After the first of the year, as y'all know, I get to be a little bit active on social media, and I'm part of several chiropractic groups that cover a variety of topics, techniques, specialties, mostly because I just love learning about every aspect of chiropractic. In January, I started noticing a very common theme through every single group that I was a part of, where people were asking for questions on how to combat burnout in practice. Was it burnout, or did they no longer really just have the heart to be a chiropractor or to own a chiropractic practice? And I remember that I was in Las Vegas with my dear friend, Dr. Jay Greenstein, and he and I were talking about this. And I was really looking for an expert, and I just couldn't think of one within our profession who could tackle the topic of burnout. And he said, I know just the guy. And so he referred to me to, as it turns out, a very good friend. They've been friends for over a decade. And practically neighbors, I just learned, in DC. And he referred me to Jeff. And I am so excited because for many, many months, Jeff and I have just been talking about this topic, and just the rising topic of burnout in particular, really within our country and probably around the world since the pandemic. And he just has a wealth of resources and an incredible background that made him the perfect person to really tackle this topic. So Jeff, thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for doing this webinar. And I'm so grateful for Jay for making that introduction to bring you here today.
Sure. Well, thank you, Christy, and welcome everybody. I really hope that this is not only informative in a productively actionable way, because that's really my commitment. What's the point of what it is that you're having a conversation about, and what can you do to change the course of things for the better? And so any questions that you have or things that you want to hit a little bit more, please feel free to post in the chat, so that we can at least do our best to make this interactive. One thing that I would say contextually is my experience includes working with businesses of all sizes, which includes smaller organizations. And part of the reason that I know Jay as well as I do, not the entirety, because I did a lot of work for his business, but I also have been a patient of his practice for a long time. And so I have a couple of levels of appreciation for the work in which you're involved and the setting in which many of you likely find yourselves. And I was glad to see that in response to the poll, everybody who responded said, yeah, burnout is real. It's a real thing. And I think like with a lot of things in our lives, acceptance is really important. Acknowledgement is helpful. Acceptance is important. And then, what can we do about it? But as you see on this first slide, there are a couple of dimensions of definition. And I would just say that sometimes, whether it's for your benefit or someone else's, understanding the impact of a situation is really important to help inform the commitment to action that you'll need to have. So if you don't want to see people's energy depleted, for example, if you don't want to see reduced professional efficacy, which would seem to be really, really relevant to this audience, then we need to figure out a way to not only acknowledge that burnout is real in some form, that there's something we can do about it, and then, of course, do it. So to back up these stats, I actually have been doing presentations about burnout for the last couple of years, really since kind of midway through the pandemic. And the data on the prevalence of burnout has changed, and not in a good way. These numbers have continued to rise. So I recently updated this to reflect something far different than what we were showing at the beginning of this effort, which was about from 2019 to 2022, the rise was from about 63% to in the 70s. And now you see 89, almost 90% of people have experienced burnout in the past year. And most of them have experienced burnout in their current job. We hope to promote open, honest, productive dialogue. When you have people who report to you, you are a manager, and having effective one-on-ones is important. And you need to be aware in all kinds of conversations of what sorts of obstacles you may be encountering, the reasons that people don't share or don't share fully. And so here are some data about what they're reluctant to share. They don't feel comfortable because. And this is something, as a leader, as a manager, you want to create an environment where people feel encouraged to share and that you help guide them towards productive action that can make a positive difference. I don't want to tell my manager that I'm really struggling. I need some space. I need to experience work a little bit differently, something we'll talk about in a moment here, because I don't want to be passed over for, future raise or promotion or whatnot. That's one of the reasons that's in play. And honestly, I think that one is probably more than 18%. But people start with this idea of just this general lack of capability to do the job or to do the job well. This is just another look at the information that's on the previous two slides. It's a little more graphic, kind of a little bit fun here, but this is something that you might want to use as a reference in terms of how burnout may show up. So if you see something like any one or more of these things going on, it's an opportunity to start a conversation, to raise the topic, and to invite people to talk about what's going on for them in the work environment. And this is why. It's how people experience their workload. The Gallup research on this, and you can see this at the bottom of the slide, is that the quality of work experience, and this is something directly in your control of influence, not total control, but to influence, is 2.5 to 3 times more impactful than the number of days or hours. So it isn't just, because this is the way we kind of started off in the pandemic. People are working more. We're on Zoom calls all day. We're working under pressure because of the way in which people are feeling overall, and that equates itself to burnout. And it's instead the quality of the experience. What's the degree of camaraderie? What's the degree of support? What's the degree of just like feeling welcome and supported? And so again, those are all things that you can place within your sphere of influence, if not total control. Questions about anything that we've looked at so far, comments that you want to share? And I'm watching the chat line here. Okay, I'll keep moving. So I'm assuming that most of you have heard of the Great Resignation, which has had all kinds of other names. Quiet quitting became popular after the Great Resignation, kind of working to rule. And so, whether you acknowledge that or that means something particularly to you, I would just say the things that are most likely to affect your team, any team member, in terms of why they would stay or go, the indicators of that are listed from this particular research. And again, sort of the overall is this idea of a toxic corporate culture. And what I would encourage here is that we not default to labels that are this broad in the conversations that we have with our people. So it's more about, why does it feel that way to you? What are the things that are happening or not happening, or the way in which they're happening, that's leading you to feel that this is not a really happy, productive, supportive place to work? And then once you are able to get people to engage with you on that level, you're much better able to identify a course or courses of action that can be helpful. I would actually drop down and look at things like failure to recognize employee performance. If you're not sharing with people regularly that they are valued and valuable and the reasons for those things, you're missing a free opportunity to connect with your people, and to connect with them in a really positive way. Let people know what it is that they do that makes you want to see them every day and happy that they're part of your team, valued and valuable. This is a quote that I really love, and I want you to think about it for a moment. The truth does not change according to our ability to stomach it emotionally. Just because people are willing, at least for some period of time, to put up with, fill in your favorite expletive there, doesn't make it okay. And a lot of times we have a grin and bear it attitude, and or, it wasn't easy when I was coming up, and this kind of almost hazing mentality that is, it's just defeatist. It's not the right way to go. So, what is true, and what I would add to that is it's about what's true for others. There's an important idea in effective communication which relates here, which is that it's not what we say, but it's what people hear, understand, and are moved to go do. So what is the truth? The truth is whatever somebody is experiencing until we help them create a different truth. So we may have common facts that we can connect to and use that to adjust the truth, but we have to recognize that the truth that someone concludes from facts, and I'm not trying to be super philosophical here, I'm just trying to help you decode the human experience, that's a really important thing to appreciate. Your truth and their truth can be very different based on the same facts. And whatever that truth is, just because they're willing and able to put up with it for a time doesn't mean that it's productive for your organization for that to happen. This quote is drawn from a study that the company that I was part of for 9 years until recently, when I joined a client organization that I had done a lot of work with. We were participants, co-authors really, of a global burnout study, and this was one of the elements within that. And just this idea of essentially, if you're not, as a leader, actively seeking to put out a fire, you're leaving it to your people individually to put it out. You're not smothering the flame that's actually causing the burnout. Put a slightly different way, people have heard me say a number of times that if you find yourself putting out the same fire over and over, you might be an arsonist. And so in organizational context, if you're not part of the solution, you are absolutely part of the problem. And so I want to shift our focus to how we can resolve the problem, so to speak, and make our situation better by intent and effective action. And so one is just thinking about well-being, and thinking about well-being across at least these 4 dimensions, because it's what it's made up of. Now, what's the emotional piece, and how can we influence that? And most of us have heard of this. I think too few of us actually practice it on a regular basis. What are we grateful for? And this is a practice that some people prefer to do in the morning. Sometimes it's at the end of the day. Sometimes it's something that you intend throughout the course of a day, but that we can approach our world as though things are good, or at least call out the things that are particularly good and that we appreciate. And so another favorite expression of ours is what we appreciate appreciates. That when you acknowledge it, it's sort of in the valued and valuable context, you get more of it. And that's a good thing too. But just expressing gratitude, most of you know this, expressing gratitude is physiologically beneficial to the body as well as psychologically. The physical piece, I imagine that most of you are proponents of this actively in what you do individually and with your patients, hopefully your teams, is exercise or do something that moves the body in a productive way. Having routines, for me, especially around sleep, hugely important. Getting enough sleep, allowing the brainwashing to occur, from a neuron perspective, not a, make me believe something that isn't true perspective, really helpful. And some degree of spirituality, you don't have to get really heavy about this, but breath work alone can be really powerful for people. And we often forget how important breath is and how disconnected from our breathing we tend to be. And then when we intentionally control it in moments of stress or just to sort of bring ourselves down from moments of even elation, just something that spikes our pulse and other things, can be really helpful and valuable. And if you share that with others in a constructive, supportive way, you're inviting them into a space that gives them more control over things. And the breathing, and I experience this with a lot of clients I work with, the breathing helps to serve as a quick illustration of that control. People often are most anxious when they feel out of control. They can control their breathing. Once they're in control of something, they can see a path to be in control of other things. Now, the company that I was part of for a long time, helped to build Shift, is very focused on connection, authentic connection in particular, on the physiological connections with our various neural networks from the brain and the head to the neural networks in our heart and in our gut, and some of the importance of those things. These dimensions are just all the things that we really want to be connected to and can be connected to, and you can, as an organizational leader, have a lot of influence over. So how connected to their organization do they feel? To their manager, which over the last 20 some years has been shown to be the number one connection of importance and impact. So if you're not familiar with these data, people say in the majority that interpersonal connections are significantly important to them in the workplace, and the most important interpersonal connection is with their direct supervisor or manager. And that makes them much more likely to stay and be engaged, so stay in a good way, or to disconnect and to leave, so to stay while they're not at their best and then to not be there at all. The people around them is another community of connection, their peers. The work, how do they feel about that? And how actively are you drawing them into understanding what they do matters and makes an impact? And their connection to self, especially as it relates back to each of those other dimensions. How are the things that are important to me being supported and served by these other communities that I'm part of? So I've already talked about this a little bit, but let's dig in a little bit deeper in terms of the role that you can play in creating a high performance culture, and really one in which people experience things more positively and productively. And the reason for that, in one way of understanding this, is that when we are clearer about what the criteria for progress and success are, then things feel more fair to us. And in fact, we're better positioned and able to make progress and to succeed. And so if we're trying to improve the experience, fairness, equity, opportunity, all those things are really important. And so you can create a lot of that by creating some clarity about what excellence includes and what you can do to enable it. Because part of what often isn't happening is when you talk to people about what's most important and how they're seeking to contribute to that, what's getting in their way. So barrier-free, I'd say, is aspirational. Less friction is probably more realistic. How can we reduce the amount of friction, the amount of unnecessary effort it may take someone to do something that's important in their job and in your organization? So, and a lot of times this stuff just grows up and then remains in our midst because nobody ever calls it out. Why do we do it that way? I don't know. Or we did it that way because we used to have certain equipment or certain challenges or whatever, and we had to create this workaround. Now we have a different system, but we're still doing it the same way. Well, let's fix that. So the more conversation you can have with people that includes what's getting in their way, and figure out ways to reduce those things as obstacles or friction or barriers, however you want to think about it, that's all good. That's all productive. So that's one particular way in which you can contribute. Overall, what this graphic seeks to communicate to you is at the bottom, start with the outcome that you want to need to produce. Define success. What will happen if we do things at a high level? We do them well. And then essentially reverse engineer. Go back to the beginning in order to determine the criteria and the mechanisms for contribution at a high level. The reality is that most organizations function like is laid out at the top, which is we equip people, we have them do the work, ultimately we assess the outcomes, but we don't start there. We kind of take what we get through the performance versus say, this is what we need, and now we got to figure out the best way to get there, which includes what people need to know, be able to do, and produce through their work. Questions about any of this or something that's not making sense or we haven't touched on yet that you want to make sure that I address? Just give you a moment if anybody wants to respond. Well, I'm going to assume that everybody's keyboard is broken, but I'm still watching, but I'll push forward here. So consistent with this layout of focus on the outcome and then work back through the process for getting that outcome, this systems-based approach is just a different layout of these criteria and how they connect to each other. And so what I would encourage you to consider is if you look at this, if you're placing too much emphasis on one area and it's not connected to another, there's an opportunity there. So a lot of us focus on elements like the skills and knowledge. Just get me people who know how to do this. And that's important, absolutely. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they fit with our organization or that we are creating the environment in which, even if they know how to do those things, that they're able to do them. So I'm just seeing a couple of questions that came up. One is, do I recommend box breathing? So that's definitely a breathing technique that I've experienced that I think has value. And honestly, I would say just going through some breath work, and I did this recently with somebody that I thought was quite good, just being talked through proper inhalation and exhalation. Many of the meditation apps, in my experience, include breathing guidance like that. If somebody, it is just sort of interesting. The way I would describe this more specifically is this guy was really good at talking us through continuing to inhale past the point that people normally would inhale. And he kind of tricked us into doing it by just following his voice track of he was still talking, he was still mentioning to, inhale fully and so forth. And I can't remember all the words that he used, but was really powerful, and the same on the exhale part and even pausing in between. So there are some specific methods, box breathing being one, that you could certainly rely on. And I think honestly, just finding somebody probably, doing some work either through YouTube or in one of the apps like Calm or whatnot can be really helpful. But for each person, it's, try some stuff out. And if there's something that you like, it's great. There's a guy named Dan Harris who wrote a book a few years ago about meditation for fidgety people. and his sensibility is consistent with the same ideas, that there's no one right way to do this, but you can find your way, and anything that you do can be helpful. So I hope that helps, as far as the question around box breathing and broader techniques. And then there's a question here from Terry about practical recommendations. So I'm hoping to be providing some of those. I wonder if there's something specific that you'd like a recommendation about, so I don't fail to respond appropriately to that. I'm going to show the next slide, but I'll keep an eye on the chat for any updates that you might want to share. I alluded to this before as far as the importance of the connection between a direct supervisor and a job holder as one example. Expectations and feedback. We often think, I'll just sort of share it with you this way, and there are a number of steps that we list out on this slide, but we often expect people to know what we're thinking without really making it clear to them by sharing it, number one, saying the words, and number two, way more importantly, asking for their confirmation, which is not done as well by saying, do you understand? Is that clear? Does that make sense? Etc. It's much more about, okay, so I've walked you through, if we're at this sort of primary stage, I've walked you through the four things that are most important, and where I see you starting this effort this week, today, what have you. Say back to me what you're taking from this conversation and where you see yourself as starting, just as one example. But it's an active confirmation process that allows a back and forth that gets us to a place of shared commitment. You often need to direct, pull, push people into a space that they may be resisting or not fully recognizing, or something along those lines. And the only way you're going to know what they really think, what they're understanding essentially, is by asking them. And when they say it back to you, but say it differently than you are intending they hear it, you got to keep working that. So that is an active process that can be much better done than we typically do it. If you're talking to a group, this is one little sliver of opportunity, but language is so important, and we miss this. And we miss it because, parenthetically, and I will spare you my full rant on this, but years and years ago, there was one study done in a sales organization about something specific that concluded in the context of that study that the actual choice of words accounted for only 7% of what people understood from the message. In other words, words aren't very important and everything else is. And that is total bullshit in the larger realm of communication effectiveness. The words you choose, absolutely how you say them, when you say them, where you say them, how many times you say them, those things are important. But the words themselves, they matter a whole heck of a lot. So choose your words thoughtfully and share them with people in a way that, again, we confirm that they understand. And when we are satisfied that they're prepared to go do something consistent with what we intend, then we're better than however we started that conversation. But another little trick along the lines of words are important is, if you present some information, the traditional thing to say is, any questions? The likelihood of somebody asking a question when you say any questions is not that great. What questions do you have? What have I said that really resonates? What have I said that doesn't really land or make sense to you? What else would you like to hear about? What would you like to hear more about? Those are all ways in which to engage people in meaningful, productive conversation, which is what you intend when you say something like any questions. But I'm just sharing with you that you'll get a lot more bang for your buck if you try any of the other options that I just went through. something that I found true in working with chiropractic clinics in particular is job design and the procedures, which are very important in what you do, sometimes aren't really assessed through the lens of the people doing them, who, no matter how expert you might be from your perch and experience, it doesn't take long to get a little bit of distance from and lose the full appreciation for what it's like to be, a rehab specialist or whatever the various roles are in your environment. So regularly checking in with people to see how things are working is helpful. And also reinforcing the reason that you do things in a particular way. If you are functioning on a system and when you have insurance considerations and frankly just cash flow considerations, there are a lot of reasons why the way you do things are really, really important, but the people on the floor may not really be connected with those reasons. Why would they be? They've never run a business like yours. And so help them by explaining it to them. There's research that shows that when we understand how we make money as an organization, we are much better at doing our jobs individually. We see the connections. We understand the reasons. We can even be more innovative. So make sure that and this is something, and I don't think Jay would be upset with me for sharing this. One of the first things that I did when I started working with him years ago was encouraging him to share more financial information with his team, because that would help them better understand how the organization was performing and how it needed to perform in order to be successful enough to, for example, afford them bonuses, or to afford them a company picnic, or to afford them the opportunity to continue working there at all. So those things are useful. And just, when you think about the design of things, don't forget the why, don't forget to share the why, and don't forget to check in periodically on how it's working for them, the people actually doing the work that you've created the design and the process for. Rewards, recognition, and consequences. I think those labels are pretty straightforward. It's important to recognize, if you will, that there's a difference between reward and recognition. Recognition is a form of reward, I should say. And people really benefit from both. And often the recognition piece is a precursor to the reward. And I would just say about recognition, if you intend for that to be a real positive thing, check in with your people, know your audience, because not everybody likes to be recognized in the same way. So one of the most common examples of that is recognizing somebody publicly, which makes them feel really uncomfortable. So you have a couple choices in that circumstance. One is to not do it, to recognize them privately or more privately. The second is kind of an A and B. One, don't surprise them, give them a heads up. And two, give them a heads up because you are making an example of them in a way that you hope to influence others. So invite them to help you out by being recognized publicly. That's an idea, and that's a little bit specific, but it's something that comes up a lot. And then there are non-compensatory things that, non-monetary ways to recognize or even reward people that, that you can look at that are creative and have a lot of value. Now, ultimately, there is some price of admission range where you're going to have to pay people a certain amount to keep them around for a productive period of time, but you have to study your market and your industry to know what those things are. So there's a lot in that space. The consequences piece, I would say this, from a motivation perspective, and again, there's a ton of research on this, from a motivation perspective, it is really detrimental for people to work in an environment where they look at somebody who is consistently doing less, performing at a lesser level, and being recognized and rewarded in a way that is similar, if not the same as they are. Now, to the extent that that's true, that's a really powerful negative. It will cause demotivation on the part of the people who are actually doing the job well, and eventually they'll leave. If it's a perception, it's still a problem, but you need to address it a little bit differently because they're misreading something that they need to understand differently. But ultimately, my point here is that if there's no consequence, if we are given opportunities, don't demonstrate the willingness and or ability to perform up to the level that's being asked of us, and nothing happens, then very few people, if any, are going to perform up to that level. So I'm pausing here in case anyone has a reaction or has something they'd like me to comment on further. And we're just kind of working around that circle, all designed to get to that kind of holy grail of exemplary performance or high performance. And the reason for that, and there's a great book written by a former colleague of mine called Thrive, and it's about this, is that if you look at the performance curve, most of us are familiar with the traditional bell curve, which essentially cuts our employee population in half and says everybody to the right of the bisecting line in the big part of the hump, everybody to the right is good. And we're just working to get everybody into the good category. And what we actually know is that you have to move much further to the right to find the highest value, and that the highest value contribution is way more valuable than even the good contribution. So we need to be working to move the good, and especially the very good, to the exemplary in order to benefit the most from high performance. This is not an incremental process. It's really an exponential impact, and we need to actively seek that out. And these are the components of that effort. And to be clear, just to loop back to where we started, all of this has to do with and positively influences the experience people have, not what we do, but how people take it in. And when we can help to put people in control of their progress and their success, that experience necessarily improves. And there's much more to it than that. But when we're thinking about burnout becomes this kind of appendage of, well, this is other thing. We've got this, and we've got these other things that sort of float through the workspace consciousness as fads. And there are a lot of people out there that seek to make money off of this without helping to provide a solution. This is true, for example, when looking at multi-generational members of our workforce and essentially saying these kids today, the irony is that these kids today, meaning people who are newer to the workforce, the things that are consistently held true about them since the late 60s, at least, because it's been studied, the generation gap has been studied at least for that period of time. It's all the same. It's all the same. Like, the context varies a little bit. Obviously, technology and the speed of things and so forth, that all evolves. But so-called Gen Z members of the workforce may have a specific marker or two, but in totality, what they're interested in, what they value, the way in which you can get more out of them and support them better is not significantly different than what people in the millennial crowd were looking for, that Gen Xers were looking for, and that even baby boomers appreciate, but they didn't, for whatever reason, choose to be as vocal in some cases about what they needed and wanted as people entering the workforce in more recent iterations. And that's not to say that there aren't some generational, components that, as I said before, are a little bit different, but the generational truths, the things that really we have in common, far outweigh, and there's very compelling research on this, those things that make us different. And when people create a cottage industry out of emphasizing the differences, they do us a disservice. And you should be sort of on the lookout for people like that and seek out help from others who make it about how we connect, again, to each other, to the work that we do, to the people we serve, and so forth. And so this idea here, that the outdated rituals, routines, and so forth, this can be part of that effort. What is important to our people? What do they rally around? What do they value? What would they value? And are we doing things that are consistent with that? Not because we're trying to solve for Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, but because we care about our people, and there are things that we believe in organizationally, meaning the leadership believes in and the organization reflects those beliefs, that we want to invest in and invite people to embrace. And if it's not right for them, then probably being here in the long term isn't right for them. And that's totally fine, as long as we know it, we're honest about it, and we take action on it. I don't know that this is true in your business experience. I can say with great conviction that in the business world overall, the number one thing that makes people's business lives suck is meetings, is lots of meetings, is meetings that aren't productive, is meetings we don't need to be in, is meetings that don't cause us to take action that makes a difference. So just if you think about this in a broad way and then apply it to your particular circumstance, what are we seeking to accomplish through the meetings that we have? And therefore, what meetings do we need to have? How long should they last? How frequently should they occur? Who should attend them? And then how do we structure them to be most productive? And there is a long history of guidance along that particular line. What do we need to do in order to make them productive? They need to have an agenda. So you have this meeting on the calendar because there's something in particular that you need to cover. Some people use things like level 10 meetings. That gives you an idea of an agenda and how to progress through that agenda, how to stay focused on that agenda. What I would offer with level 10 as an example is be wary of taking that, which is a good core structure, and then the what I would say is kind of showmanship around the process, which is the rating of the meeting. Because what I found too many times to take it as an accident is people say the same thing about that process. I just tell the person running the meeting that it was a 10 because I don't want to have a conversation with them about why it wasn't. And that's the same kind of crapola that Uber does with its ratings. I don't know if any of you have noticed this, but if you take an Uber and you get the rating, which it requires you to provide, if you do not rate a ride 5 stars, 5 out of 5, it interprets that as a negative and you have to explain yourself. Now, I think 4 stars is pretty darn good, and that should be okay. And I could tell you why it's 4 stars positively, but I shouldn't have to explain why it's 4 stars negatively. If you're not really interested in understanding how you can get better, then don't, but also don't necessarily start with the negative. So it's this balance in here of, don't allow people to perfunctorily blow you off or require them to so that they don't have to face the music, but make it consistent with why we're having the meeting, how regularly we're having the meeting, who attends the meeting, and how we productively move through that respective agenda, not just because we've always had it, or even that we think we should. State your case, test your hypothesis, and then adjust accordingly. There's an expression that people use, it's not rocket science. I'm actually a fan of saying it is rocket science because what I just described is rocket science. It's science. It's have a hypothesis, set up an experiment, test it out, observe what happens, and make adjustments based on that. What it isn't is brain surgery. We don't have to be right before we even try because there are huge consequences if we're not quite right. So if you want to reassess your meeting structure, get rid of meetings, not hold meetings on a particular day, whatever, try it out. See how it works. my guess is it's not going to be too bad, and you'll learn something through the process of rocket science, and then you can make an adjustment and make it even better the next time. This is a quote that I've shared a number of times, and often we'll get some people saying that this isn't really true or true for them. You can't be too honest. If you learn how to make it safe, you can talk to almost anyone about almost anything. I'm somebody who's earned a reputation for being able to tell people things they need to hear in ways that they're able to absorb. And so I am a believer that this is at least close to true if you make the commitment. And certainly in the context of work, where you have a little bit of a closed community in which you have a little more permission and latitude to connect with people on a number of things that are relevant to the work, which don't have to be only work related. Like something going on in our lives can come into the workplace and affect us, and so it's worth having conversations about. But it's the way in which we approach these issues that is really the opportunity that we have. And you may be thinking about this in this moment, people often will talk to me about or ask me about, how do I have the difficult conversation? And so we know what that is code for. The difficult conversation is the one in which we tell somebody that they're not living up to the standard that we need them to be successful in the role that they occupy. They're not doing their job well or well enough. And somebody pointed out to me a number of years ago, he called that a difficult conversation. But if you had to choose between a conversation in which you said, hey, look, here's what is not getting done that needs to get done. Here's why I believe, or at least how I believe you can get to that point. And I'm here to work with you in order to help support you over whatever the period of time is to get there. Would you rather have that conversation with somebody or the other conversation, which is today is your last day? That, for most of us, is the much more difficult conversation. So, I'd ask you just to kind of open your minds and your heart to this idea of candor, even more than honesty, of what does this person need to know? How do they need to see themselves through the lens that I have, which as the manager and maybe even the owner of the company is the most important lens. Like they can experience and believe whatever they want, but at some point they need to have the benefit of how they're being seen by others and how their behavior, for example, is impacting others. That's really helpful, productive candor. And if it comes in the form of the reason we're having this conversation is so that I can understand how to better support your success, or to help you have a fighting chance to stay here, if that's something that you want, that is making it safe and being able to talk to pretty much anybody about pretty much anything. And that's just a well-informed and significant, I think significantly important area of passion that I bring to the table as somebody who has been in this space for a long, long time and had many of those this is your last day conversations with people on behalf of companies that I ran, on behalf of companies that I was part of, and on behalf of companies that were clients of mine. So I have a lot of experience with this. I'm not just making it up or passing it off as something that is easy to do. It's not, but it's really important to do. And when you don't do it, you fail the any reasonable test. Not that anything humanly possible test, but the anything reasonably possible test of helping somebody understand what they need to be willing and able to do and give them the opportunity to demonstrate that willingness and ability. Mindset is a label we throw around a whole heck of a lot. And I would just say, mindset is real, and however you come to it is really up to you, but encourage, I think the ideas of we get to do certain things versus we have to do certain things is a very healthy way to approach this. Understanding the difference and the role that you can play between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. So as a leader, I bring to you external things that I want you to be aware of and hopefully interested in, excited about, et cetera. That's the extrinsic part. And I need to try to tap into something inside of you, which is way more powerful, which is the thing that moves you, the intrinsic. But I'm not in control of that. But the more I know people, and that's part we had through the kind of conversations we've been talking about the last few minutes, the better able I am to know at least around the vicinity of where your trigger is, if not know exactly what it might be. Remember you said that in 5 years you want to run your own company. This is the way to help you get there. That is the invitation for them to connect intrinsically to what it is that I need or want them to do. And periodically, as part of your one-on-ones, which again are just a critical currency that you hold, to have dedicated time with each member of your team who reports to you directly, and make sure that others who manage people directly are doing the same thing. I would say once a week. If it is once a week, doesn't have to be more than 20 minutes. If it's less than once a week, it has to be a little bit longer. And it's not something that you're doing now if you don't have designated and dedicated one-on-ones. If you are passing in the course of your work, I talk to people all the time. We talk about the work all the time. Yes, that's great. And it's not a one-on-one. And it is rarely an opportunity in which you, with great sincerity and interest, ask people how they are. How are you? Not, hey, how you doing? How are you? And sometimes that's informed by something that you may have observed or something you heard. I was working with one of my charges yesterday, and the guy said to me twice, I'm dealing with some family issues. And I gave him space each time to share with me a little bit more. He chose not to, so then I asked him directly. And in fact, he accepted the invitation at that point. And the stuff that's going on in his quote unquote personal life is relevant to his work life. And I can be more thoughtful and supportive in how I work with him because he was willing to share, but he was willing to share because I was willing to ask. And so that's something that can be part of how you not only approach work with your own mindset of value, but you invite somebody to do something along those lines too. What's your mindset and how can I influence your mindset or invite you to adjust your mindset in order to be more productive? So it's a combination and really a collaboration that can get us to that place. But if you ask somebody one question from time to time, no less than once a month, how are you? And really listen to what they said and invited them into the space of sharing whatever was important. And when they got to the end of whatever they volunteered, maybe asking what else or something along those lines to invite them to share even more. How effectively would you be able to work with that person? How much more effectively? Because you actually begin to know them and understand them in a way that you've made time and made the effort to allow. I think that's really exciting, and I know it's within the capacity of everybody on this call. Part of making it safe, there's some elements to this. I would just say probably 3 things that are on this list. Go first. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's sort of leading by example. Share with them. You don't have to do this every time. You don't have to do it in great detail. You can pick your spots, but it's really powerful. Listen. And some of you have read this before. I will repeat it for you now. Listening requires that you not be thinking about the next thing that you're going to ask them or say to them. You cannot listen when you're preparing your comment. Listen. Put yourself, it's like the breathing exercise. Put yourself in a place where the only thing that matters is their voice and their words. Listen. And then share with them. You can ask questions, good questions. I don't know, I'm not here to rate the quality of your questions, but if you're willing to be vulnerable and transparent, that's really where the power can come from. Acknowledge that maybe you've experienced something similar to what they're sharing. maybe share with them something that challenged you and how you addressed it and came through it. Go there. Certainly be willing to share that, you've made mistakes or had issues, or, maybe lost a job or whatever. Like make it real. It doesn't have to be a TEDx kind of, talk where you got run over by a boat while fighting a shark in order to save a baby and a baby seal or whatever. But something that's real, from your life, that makes you human, for lack of a better way of saying that, and allows them to feel more on your level. You're not coming with magic answers. You're not talking down to them. You're really inviting them into this space of, I want to be helpful to you, and understanding more about what's going on for you is the way I can do that. And I'm willing to share. I'm not just asking you to reveal yourself. I'm revealing myself too. That's a way to make a really powerful connection. Some of you have heard of this process with some formality stay interviews. They're great. In a smaller organization in particular, I'd be less formal and more intentional about this, meaning that in my one-on-ones in particular, I would periodically ask questions that are on this list. Like, what is something that we're doing well that makes you want to stay? And what would be something that would cause you to consider leaving? Sometimes you can be more aggressive about that and say, what's something that we're doing that is causing you to consider leaving, especially if you think that that's on the table. And if you tie back to the last slide, one of the ways to think about this is what you may have seen either in general or maybe previously in the organization, something that will affect people. So again, in my experience with chiropractic work in a particular setting, one of the things that would come up a lot is people would have an aspiration beyond what they could fulfill within the company. And part of what my encouragement was and our process became was make that okay. Like let's be 4-dimensional, not just 3-dimensional, that the reality and opportunity can include things outside of the company. But the reason that you want to come here and maybe stay here for a certain amount of time and learn how to do certain things is that in order to go out there and do the thing that you said is really important to you and we want to support, and we are anticipating within 18 months or 2 years, but we want to be 18 months or 2 years versus 12 months, is to learn how to do this thing, to do it at a certain level, to do it for a certain amount of time. And that'll put us in an even better position to support you when the time comes in making a move to something else. So the stay interview can be a formal periodic process, but you can just incorporate one or a couple of these questions into regular conversations that you have and really normalize that and give people permission to tell you what's going on for them. And, again, the things that they're responding well to and the things that really kind of hack them off. This slide we include a lot because, gosh, it's a reality for most of us in more than one of these variations on the theme. And this is just a way to check yourself from time to time. Am I, being the persecutor, the rescuer, the victim? And I often find that the victim and rescuer sort of team up. In other words, it's woe is me, but I have to help pull these people out of the vat of oil that they're going to otherwise boil in. And, what we want to do is acknowledge the issue, invite people into being part of the solution. There's an expression in executive coaching that I'm fond of, which is invite people to participate in their own success. And it's really hard to do that if we're enveloped in being the rescuer. Sometimes we need to be the rescuer in the moment, but never be frozen by the moment only. In other words, find the opportunity after the moment to debrief and then to use the opportunity that you've created by rescuing them once to not have to rescue them, or at least rescue them in the same way again. So that's what I brought to bear. I would love to have some interaction with you if you're open to it about what you found valuable and what else might be helpful. I did share ahead of time this beating burnout blueprint. So I'm not sure how those get distributed, but Christy has access to them. And if there's any issue with that, we can certainly share it again. It's just a planning document, pretty straightforward, to help you do some of the things that we covered, in this conversation. And you see, check on yourself. Are you feeling burned out? I hope not. I hope not, at least by virtue of this, last whatever hour or so. And then make sure that you talk to the people around you about how they're doing, and then come up hopefully with a plan of action that that leads you to this collaborative effort for better. What I don't want you to leave with is this idea that it's all on me. But what I do want you to leave with is that you have a significant opportunity to influence the experience that people have in the workplace that will determine their well-being, their ability and willingness to be engaged, and through that, their opportunity to perform at a high level, which I imagine sounds like an attractive outcome to anybody leading a business. So thank you for sharing your time with me, and I hope this is valuable, and I'd like to make it more valuable if people have questions they want to fire my way.
Thank you so much, Jeff. And I did put in the chat log that if y'all click on the files button, you'll be able to download that blueprint from Jeff. And if you are watching the recording, again, same way to access it, or you can also email Susan at susan@ChiroHealthUSA.com and just say that you would like a copy of the blueprint, and she will email that over to you. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, for being a part of the webinar, and we will see you at the same time, same place in 2 weeks. So, I'm sorry, not 2 weeks, because then we'd be here on the 4th of July. So I hope you're not working on that day. I hope you're having a wonderful and relaxing day. We're going to reconvene in 3 weeks on July the 11th. So everybody have an amazing rest of your week, a fabulous day, a wonderful 4th of July long weekend, and I will see you guys on the 11th. Bye, y'all.